Picture this, a hilltop mansion perched like a crown above the Hudson River, its stone walls glowing in the afternoon light, terraced gardens cascading down the slope in perfect geometrical precision, sculptures by Picasso and Calder gleaming among the roses, and beneath it all, beneath the manicured lawns and the Beaux-Arts fountains and the 40 rooms filled with Chinese ceramics and European masterpieces, a network of underground tunnels where servants moved like ghosts through the machinery of perfection, their footsteps echoing in passages that stretched for hundreds of feet, service corridors designed specifically so that the people who made this paradise possible would never be seen by the people who owned it, and this is Kykuit, the Dutch word for lookout, the Rockefeller family's monument to American capitalism at its most triumphant and most terrible, a 3,400-acre private kingdom built with money that flowed from the bodies of workers crushed in coal mines and the dreams of independent oilmen destroyed by monopolistic practices so ruthless they would eventually be declared illegal by the Supreme Court itself, and this estate, this temple to wealth, holds within its walls and beneath its gardens the complete story of American power across 4 generations, a story of ambition and philanthropy, of labor massacres and art collections, of political dynasties and scandalous deaths, a story that asks the most uncomfortable question of all, what does it cost to build paradise? And who pays the price? The answer begins not on this hilltop but in the oil fields of Pennsylvania and the boardrooms of Cleveland, with a man whose name would become synonymous with both unparalleled wealth and ruthless monopoly, John Davison Rockefeller Sr., born in 1839 to a con artist father who sold dubious elixirs as miracle cures and disappeared for months at a time, and a deeply religious mother who raised her children in poverty while her husband lived a double life, and from this unstable childhood, Rockefeller absorbed contradictory lessons that would define his entire approach to business and life. From his father he learned that the world was a competition where the cunning survived and the naive were exploited, that every transaction was a battle of wits where sentiment was weakness and victory was all that mattered, but from his mother he learned the Baptist faith that would anchor his self-image throughout his life, the belief that God ordained success as a reward for virtue, that wealth was evidence of divine favor, that the accumulation of money was not greed but stewardship, and these two worldviews, predatory capitalism and religious righteousness, fused in Rockefeller's mind into a seamless whole, allowing him to pursue business practices that destroyed competitors and impoverished families while genuinely believing he was doing God's work. And he understood something fundamental about American capitalism in the 1860s and 1870s that his contemporaries did not. He understood that in the chaos of the oil boom, with hundreds of wildcatters drilling crude from the Pennsylvania ground and dozens of small refineries processing it into kerosene for America's lamps, the real money wasn't in the unpredictable business of extraction but in controlling the stable, systematic work of refinement and distribution, in creating a system so comprehensive and so ruthlessly efficient that competition itself would become impossible, and so in 1870 he founded Standard Oil. And by the 1880s he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity, and he achieved this through methods that would later be described in devastating detail by journalist Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been one of the independent oilmen Rockefeller destroyed, and Tarbell's exposé, published in McClure's magazine starting in 1902 and later as The History of the Standard Oil Company, revealed the systematic campaign of corporate warfare that built the Rockefeller fortune. He extracted secret rebates from railroads that gave him shipping rates his competitors couldn't match, sometimes paying as little as 10 cents per barrel while his rivals paid 35 cents, and even more ingeniously he received drawbacks, payments on his competitors' shipments, so that every barrel they moved actually put money in Rockefeller's pocket, effectively making his rivals finance his own operations. And he sent spies into competing companies to steal their business strategies and customer lists, planting Standard Oil employees inside rival firms to report back on production numbers and pricing plans, and he engaged in predatory pricing, slashing the cost of kerosene below what it actually cost to produce in markets where competitors were strong, accepting massive short-term losses that his monopoly profits elsewhere could absorb while smaller companies, unable to sustain such losses, went bankrupt. And then the moment those competitors collapsed he immediately raised prices back up, sometimes higher than they'd been before, extracting maximum profit from markets he now controlled alone, and he bought out struggling companies at pennies on the dollar, showing up at refineries that were hemorrhaging money due to his predatory tactics and offering to purchase them for a fraction of their actual value, and when owners refused to sell, when they tried to hold out and fight back, he arranged for railroads to refuse their shipments, to claim there were no cars available even as Standard Oil's trains rolled past fully loaded, and without the ability to transport their product to market, these refiners had no choice but to capitulate, to sell at whatever price Rockefeller offered, or to simply shut down and watch their life's work crumble. And through these tactics that a Pennsylvania grand jury would indict him for in 1879 on charges of monopolizing the oil trade and restraining commerce. Though the charges would ultimately be dismissed due to jurisdictional technicalities, he became by the 1890s the richest man, not just in America but in American history, worth over $400 billion in today's dollars, commanding a fortune so vast that it represented nearly 2% of the entire American economy. And yet throughout all of this, throughout every destroyed competitor and every manipulated market and every secret deal, Rockefeller attended Baptist services faithfully, tithed 10% of his income to the church even before he was wealthy, and continued the practice throughout his life, taught Sunday school to working-class children, read the Bible daily, and believed with absolute sincerity that God had given him the gift of making money, that his success was evidence of divine approval, that he was not a robber baron but a rationalist who brought order to chaos, efficiency to waste, and progress to an industry that had been mired in destructive competition, and this ability to compartmentalize, to pursue ruthless tactics while maintaining genuine religious conviction, to destroy thousands of small businessmen while believing he was serving a higher purpose, reveals something essential about the nature of extreme wealth. It requires a kind of moral architecture where the suffering caused by one's actions can be separated from one's self-image, where the screams of the crushed can be muted by the conviction that one is building something greater. And Rockefeller maintained throughout his life that he was simply more efficient than his competitors, that his success was not ruthlessness but rationality, that the small oilmen he destroyed were casualties of progress, inevitable losses in the march toward industrial modernization, and besides, he would say, hadn't he brought the price of kerosene down from 58 cents a gallon to 8 cents, hadn't he made light affordable for working families, hadn't his efficiency benefited consumers even as it ruined competitors, and this argument, that monopoly could serve the public good even as it crushed individual enterprise, would be tested in American courts for decades, culminating in the Supreme Court's decision in Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus United States in 1911, when the court ruled that Rockefeller's petroleum conglomerate had illegally monopolized the American petroleum industry and ordered the company to break itself up into 34 separate entities, and the ruling came too late to help the thousands of independent oilmen who'd already been destroyed, too late to reverse the consolidation of power that had made one man richer than entire states, but it established a principle that would echo through American antitrust law for generations, that even efficiency, even lower prices, even genuine innovation could not justify the concentration of economic power in hands of a single individual or corporation, that competition itself had value beyond mere market outcomes, that the structure of the economy mattered as much as its results, and yet even as the Supreme Court was dismantling his monopoly, Rockefeller had already begun the process of transforming his legacy, shifting his public image from robber baron to philanthropist, giving away hundreds of millions to establish the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University and the Rockefeller Foundation, funding medical research that would lead to vaccines and treatments that saved millions of lives, creating an infrastructure of giving that would eventually distribute more than half his fortune. And this philanthropic campaign was not separate from his business career but its continuation by other means, another form of control, another system for shaping the world according to his vision, and it was with this fortune, built on methods that had been declared illegal, on monopolistic practices that had crushed thousands of competitors, on secret deals and predatory pricing and corporate espionage, that he began in the 1890s quietly purchasing land in Westchester County, sending agents to buy up 17 farms totaling 3,500 acres of rolling hills overlooking the Hudson River, buying so quietly and through so many intermediaries that local farmers didn't realize they were selling to the richest man in America until after the transactions were complete. And here, on the highest point in Pocantico Hills, looking out over the Tappan Zee with views extending 25 miles south to the skyline of Manhattan, he would build his own private empire, a kingdom where he could control every road and every tree and every person who entered, where he could create the perfection that his business methods had achieved in oil Refining, where the chaos of competition and criticism and legal challenges could be replaced by the serenity of absolute control, where he could finally, after decades of being vilified in newspapers and attacked from pulpits and condemned by progressive reformers like Ida Tarbell who made her name exposing his business practices, have peace, have beauty, have a place where the world worked exactly as he believed it should work, efficiently and hierarchically and without the messy complications of democracy or dissent, and he and his wife Laura Spelman Rockefeller moved in 1893 into the Parsons Wentworth House, one of the existing properties on the land, sharing the upstairs rooms with their adult children and in-laws, spending winter weekends and parts of each summer and fall there, and Rockefeller Sr. began immediately to shape the landscape according to his vision, walking the grounds daily, studying every vista and view, deciding exactly where roads should wind and which trees should be moved and how the natural topography could be enhanced and perfected, and he wasn't satisfied with planting saplings and waiting for them to grow, he wanted mature trees immediately, wanted the landscape to appear as if it had always been this perfect, and so he had massive trees dug up from other parts of the property and transplanted to new locations, an enormously expensive and technically difficult process that symbolized everything about Rockefeller's approach to wealth. Nature itself could be rearranged, time itself could be bought, if you had enough money and enough will, and then on September 17, 1902, the Parsons Wentworth house burned down, and the New York Times reported that Rockefeller had never been satisfied with the house's electrical wiring, which had been installed before certain safety measures were developed, that he had ordered workers to reroute the wires into conduits, work which had been planned to commence the day after it was preempted by the fire, and the loss was estimated at $40,000, and the family moved temporarily into the Kent House, another property on the estate, and Rockefeller Sr. gave his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., the task of building something permanent, something worthy of the family name, something that would stand for generations as a monument to everything the Rockefellers had achieved, and Jr., born in 1874, the only son to survive to adulthood among 5 children, burdened from birth with the weight of continuing his father's empire, unable to match his father's business genius and aware of his own inadequacy in that realm, desperately seeking to prove himself worthy through other means, approached the task with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his father's business conquests, hiring architects Chester Holmes Aldrich and William Adams Delano, the former a distant relative of Jr.'s wife Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, to design what would initially be a steep-roofed 3-story stone mansion. And the initial structure took 6 years to complete, from 1906 to 1912, but before it was even occupied, Jr. decided it wasn't right, wasn't impressive enough, wasn't sufficiently grand to represent the Rockefeller name, and so he had it substantially rebuilt into its present 4-story classical revival Georgian form, hiring interior designer Ogden Codman Jr. to create rooms that would reflect both elegance and taste, and the final structure was completed in 1913. A 40-room palace constructed of locally quarried rough-cut fieldstone and Indiana limestone, and the house had 2 basement levels filled with interconnecting passageways and service tunnels, hundreds of feet of underground corridors where servants could move invisibly, where the machinery of the house, the furnaces and electrical systems and storage rooms and staff quarters, could be accessed without ever disturbing the family upstairs, and this architectural decision, the choice to build an entire underground infrastructure for service and labor, reveals the essential logic of extreme wealth in the Gilded Age and beyond. Luxury requires constant labor, but that labor must be invisible, must occur out of sight so that comfort appears effortless, so that the wealthy can maintain the illusion that their lifestyle is simply natural rather than constantly constructed by the hands of others, and simultaneously, while Kykuit was being built, while Jr. was selecting ceramic tiles and approving wallpaper patterns and deciding which European furnishings to import, his father owned the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which operated coal mines in southern Colorado under conditions that would soon become infamous, mines where workers labored in constant danger of cave-ins and explosions and toxic gas, where children as young as 10 worked sorting coal, where company towns controlled every aspect of workers' lives, the housing they could rent and the stores where they could shop and the schools their children could attend, all owned by the company, all designed to ensure that wages paid out immediately flowed back to company coffers, and when workers tried to organize, when the United Mine Workers Union called a strike in September 1913 demanding basic safety standards and the right to bargain collectively and an end to the company-town system, Rockefeller refused to negotiate, instructed his managers to reject all union demands, to hold firm no matter what. And the company hired private guards from the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency, armed them with rifles and machine guns, and began a campaign of intimidation against striking workers, and Rockefeller convinced Colorado Governor Elias Ammons to deploy the Colorado National Guard, supposedly to keep the peace but actually to break the strike, and 11,000 miners and their families were evicted from company housing and forced to set up tent colonies in the surrounding hills, living through the Colorado winter in canvas tents, trying to survive while the company waited for them to give up and return to work on management's terms. And on April 20, 1914, just 1 year after Kykuit was completed, 1 year after Jr. had finished putting the final touches on his perfect hilltop mansion, the Colorado National Guard and company guards attacked the tent colony at Ludlow, and the battle lasted all day, machine gun fire raking the tents, strikers and guards shooting at each other, and then the guards set fire to the tents, and families fled in panic, and in one tent 2 women and 11 children had taken shelter in a pit dug beneath the floor, hoping the depression would protect them from the gunfire, but when the tent burned, the fire sucked oxygen from the pit and all 13 suffocated, and by the time the shooting stopped and the fires burned out, 21 people were dead, including those 11 children, the youngest just 2 months old, and this was the Ludlow Massacre, and news of it spread across the nation, and suddenly John D. Rockefeller, Jr., the mild-mannered philanthropist who was building libraries and funding medical research and carefully curating his family's public image, was revealed as the man responsible for the deaths of children, and he was called to testify before the Commission on Industrial Relations, was forced to sit in a hearing room in Washington, D.C. and face the mother who had lost her children in that pit, was confronted with photographs of the charred tent and the small bodies, was asked directly whether he believed a corporation's property rights were more important than workers' lives, and Junior sat there, uncomfortable and defensive, insisting that he'd had nothing to do with the specific decisions, that he'd simply supported his managers in maintaining order, that the violence was regrettable but that the principle of refusing to negotiate with unions was correct, that recognizing the union would have been surrendering to mob rule, and the public was horrified. Editorials condemned the Rockefellers as murderers who valued profits over human life. Protests erupted outside Rockefeller offices in New York, and for the first time Jr. understood viscerally what his father had spent decades learning to ignore, that great wealth creates great hatred, that the money flowing into Kykuit's construction budget was seen by millions of Americans as blood money, that the 40 rooms and the terraced gardens and the imported sculptures were purchased at a price measured in human suffering, and how did Jr. respond? Not with immediate reform, not with recognition of union rights, not with a fundamental reconsideration of the relationship between capital and labor, but with public relations, hiring Ivy Lee, one of the first modern PR specialists, to begin the work of rehabilitating the Rockefeller image, to craft a narrative that emphasized philanthropy over exploitation, generosity over monopoly. And Lee advised Jr. to visit the Colorado mines personally, to meet with workers, to appear sympathetic and concerned, and so in 1915 Jr. traveled to Colorado and toured the mining camps and gave speeches about his commitment to workers' welfare and his desire for harmonious labor relations, and he implemented what became known as the Colorado Industrial Plan or the Rockefeller Plan, an employee representation plan, that created a company union, a system where workers could elect representatives to meet with management but where those representatives had no real power, no ability to strike, no connection to outside labor organizations, a plan that gave the appearance of worker voice without the reality of worker power, and labor historians would later condemn it as sophisticated union busting, a way to prevent actual independent organizing while appearing to be progressive, but at the time it was celebrated in some quarters as enlightened capitalism, as proof that Rockefeller had learned from Ludlow, that he was committed to reform, and this became the pattern that would define the Rockefeller approach to labor for generations. Not true justice, not genuine equality, but managed benevolence, controlled generosity, a system where the family decided how much was enough and workers were expected to be grateful, and the strategy worked. Gradually the protests died down, gradually the public's memory of Ludlow faded, gradually the Rockefeller name became associated more with philanthropic foundations than with murdered children, and up at Kykuit, life continued in its precisely orchestrated perfection, with Rockefeller Sr. spending his final decades walking the grounds, obsessively maintaining his control over every detail, and he worked personally with landscape architect William Wells Bosworth, who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and who designed the surrounding terraces and gardens with fountains and pavilions and classical sculpture in the grand French style, creating the morning garden with its carefully coordinated seasonal blooms, the grand staircase descending the hillside in perfect mathematical proportion, the Japanese garden with its raked gravel and precisely pruned trees, the Italian garden with its geometric patterns, the Japanese-style brook that wound through the property as if it had always been there, though in fact every stone had been deliberately placed, the Japanese teahouse offering a view across the valley, the massive Oceanus fountain with its bronze sea god, the temple of Aphrodite tucked into the landscape, the loggia providing shade and views, the semicircular rose garden that became Abby's particular passion, and all of this aesthetic perfection, required constant, intensive labor, required teams of gardeners working year-round to maintain the illusion of effortless beauty, required men pruning and weeding and planting and moving and adjusting, required a level of horticultural knowledge and physical effort that visitors to the gardens never saw and weren't meant to see, and we know now from records that have slowly emerged, from archives that the Rockefeller family carefully controlled for decades before gradually opening them to researchers, that Kykuit in its heyday required a permanent workforce that lived on the property, that there were extensive staff quarters, that the estate had its own farming operations with cattle herds, its own dairy producing milk and butter and cheese, its own vegetable gardens and greenhouses supplying fresh produce year-round, its own carpenter shop and blacksmith forge and laundry facilities, all of it designed to make the estate self-sufficient, to create a complete world where the family could live insulated from the broader society, and the estate had 70 private roads, most designed by Rockefeller Sr. himself, winding through the property to provide maximum scenic beauty, and it had 75 houses at its peak, occupied by family members and staff and managers, and it had a 9-hole reversible golf course designed by Willie Dunn, the architect of Shinnecock Hills, providing recreation for the family without requiring them to leave the property or interact with the public, and it had the playhouse, a rambling French Norman 2-story structure completed by Junior in 1927, 3 times the size of the main Kykuit mansion, containing an indoor swimming pool and full-size indoor tennis court and fully equipped basketball gym and squash court and billiard room and bowling alley with regulation lanes, all so that the family could have every recreational amenity without ever stepping beyond their private kingdom, and it had the coach barn, completed in 1913-14, another massive 3-story complex built of heavy local stone, originally housing the family's collection of horse-drawn carriages and later their automobiles, currently displaying 12 vintage cars that illustrate the evolution of automotive design from the early to mid-20th century, and in 1994 the lower floor of the coach barn was converted by architects into the Picantico Conference Center, a modern meeting facility where the Rockefeller Brothers Fund hosts conferences and seminars and workshops on philanthropy and social policy, where foundation presidents gather annually, where UN Security Council officials meet behind closed doors, continuing Kykuit's role as a venue of power even after the family's occupation has ended, and there was the orangery, housing citrus plants and modeled after the original at the Palace of Versailles, another example of how Rockefeller wealth could transplant European aristocratic culture to American soil, and there was the house in the museum garden, a modern structure designed by Marcel Breuer that had been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan and then disassembled and shipped to Picantico and reassembled, a literal importation of cutting-edge modernist architecture into the traditional landscape, and beneath the Hillcrest Mansion, the residence that had belonged to Martha Baird Rockefeller, Jr.'s second wife after Abby's death, there was built a 3-story underground bunker, a massive climate-controlled facility that would become the Rockefeller Archives Center, containing 150-plus years of Rockefeller papers and memorabilia and carefully curated family history. Staffed by 10 full-time archivists who manage 40-foot-long shelves on rails containing documents that trace the family's business dealings and philanthropic activities and personal correspondence, and these archives are open to researchers but access is controlled, certain materials remain restricted, the family history available to scholars is the expurgated version, The version that emphasizes positive contributions and downplays uncomfortable truths, and this is another form of control. Another way the Rockefellers have shaped their legacy, by becoming the custodians of their own history, by funding the very institutions that study them, and under the main Kykuit mansion itself there was a bomb shelter, built during the Cold War when nuclear annihilation seemed possible, and this bunker became notorious when it was revealed that in 1973 Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was close to the Rockefeller family and particularly to Nelson, had cabinet papers and private telephone transcripts delivered to Kykuit and stored in this secure location, classified government documents housed in a private family's underground vault, another blurring of the line between private wealth and public power, another example of how the Rockefellers existed in a space beyond normal rules, and throughout all of this construction and expansion, throughout the building of playhouses and conference centers and underground archives, throughout the importation of European orangeries and modernist exhibition homes, there were the servants, the gardeners, and cooks and maids and chauffeurs and security guards and maintenance workers and laundry staff, moving constantly through those underground tunnels, living in staff quarters that have now been reconfigured, working 14-hour days 6 days a week for wages that allowed them to survive but never to thrive, never to imagine owning land themselves, never to afford the kind of education that would allow their children to enter professional careers, never to retire with dignity but only to work until they physically couldn't anymore and then to be replaced by younger workers who would also give their lives to maintaining the comfort of people who would never know their names, and we don't have most of their names, don't have their stories, because the records that survive are the records the family chose to preserve, and those records document the architecture and the art and the important visitors and the philanthropic initiatives but not the daily lives of the people whose labor made it all possible, not their hopes and frustrations. And small victories and bitter disappointments, not the injuries they sustained or the illnesses they suffered or the families they struggled to support on insufficient wages, and this erasure, this absence from the historical record, is itself a form of violence, a way that power perpetuates itself by rendering invisible the people it depends upon. And when Rockefeller Sr. finally died in 1937 at age 97, having outlived most of his original competitors and critics, having successfully transformed his image from robber baron to benevolent patriarch, having distributed hundreds of millions in philanthropic giving while retaining enough wealth to keep his family rich for generations, he was mourned as one of the great Americans, a man who had built an industry and funded universities and made possible medical breakthroughs that saved countless lives. And the fact that he had also destroyed thousands of small businesses and monopolized an entire sector of the economy and owned the company responsible for the Ludlow massacre was mentioned but not emphasized, footnoted but not foregrounded, because by 1937 he had spent decades carefully crafting a legacy that emphasized giving over taking, creation over destruction, and the strategy had worked, the public memory had been successfully shaped, and control of Kykuit passed to Junior, who had spent his entire life in his father's shadow, who had never built a business empire of his own but had instead become the steward of his father's fortune, professionally employed in the family office managing investments and directing philanthropic initiatives, and Junior lived at Kykuit with his wife Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, an extraordinary woman whose father had been Senator Nelson Aldrich, one of the most powerful politicians of the Gilded Age, so that Junior's marriage united two of America's great power dynasties. Political influence and economic might combined in one family, and Abby was brilliant and cultured, a founder of the Museum of Modern Art along with Lily Bliss and Mary Quinn Sullivan, a collector with sophisticated taste who championed contemporary artists when conventional wisdom dismissed them as incomprehensible or degenerate, and she brought her passion for modern art into Kykuit, beginning the transformation of the estate from a monument to 19th-century capitalism into something more complex, a space where old money and new art could coexist, where the fortune built by destroying competitors could be used to celebrate creative innovation, and this was not hypocritical but entirely consistent with the Rockefeller worldview. Wealth gave one the freedom and obligation to be a cultural steward, to use money to shape taste, to determine which artists would be celebrated and which forgotten, to exercise power not just economically but aesthetically. And after Abby's death in 1948 and Junior's death in 1960, Kykuit entered its third generation under the occupation of Nelson Rockefeller, Junior's second son, born in 1908, and Nelson was fundamentally different from his grandfather and father. He was charismatic where they were reserved, flamboyant where they were careful, ambitious for public glory where they had been content with private influence, and he understood that in the 20th century power was increasingly public, that wealth alone wasn't enough. That true influence required political position, and so Nelson set out to conquer politics with the same systematic determination his grandfather had brought to oil, and he became governor of New York in 1959, serving 4 terms until 1973, and he used the governorship as a platform for massive construction projects, building the State University of New York system with multiple campuses across the state, building the Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller Empire State Plaza in Albany, a massive modernist complex of government buildings and cultural facilities that cost $2 billion. And required the demolition of an entire historic neighborhood, displacing thousands of residents in the name of urban renewal, and Nelson believed genuinely that he was improving New York, that these projects would serve future generations, but he also understood that buildings were monuments, that architecture announced power, that covering the landscape with structures bearing your name was a form of immortality, and he funded these projects through massive state borrowing, through bond issues that pushed New York's debt to unprecedented levels, creating obligations that future taxpayers would have to meet, and this was the Rockefeller approach applied to government: spend enormously, build grandly, worry about the cost later, and the same approach shaped Nelson's transformation of Kykuit, because he didn't just occupy the estate, he reimagined it, turned it into his personal gallery and political salon, and he began collecting 20th century art with his mother's passion but on a scale that only Rockefeller wealth could sustain, acquiring works by every major modern artist, Picasso and Braque and Leger, Chagall and Miro and Kandinsky, Warhol and Lichtenstein and Rauschenberg, and he transformed the previously empty basement passages beneath Kykuit, those service tunnels that had been designed for staff, into a major private art gallery with climate control and professional lighting, hanging Picassos in spaces where servants had once carried laundry, and both Chagall and Warhol visited Kykuit, toured the collection, saw their work displayed in this underground palace, and between 1935 and the late 1970s Nelson added more than 120 works of modern sculpture to the gardens and grounds, so that walking through Kykuit became like walking through the sculpture garden of a world-class museum, and there was Picasso's bathers, abstract bronze figures placed beside the Japanese garden, and Constantine Brancusi's smooth modernist forms that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, and Karel Appel's Mouse on Table, and works by Jean Arp and Alexander Calder with his signature mobiles and stabiles, and Alberto Giacometti's impossibly elongated figures, and Henry Moore's reclining forms, and Louise Nevelson's sculptural walls, and Isamu Noguchi's Black Sun, a massive granite circle with a void at its center, and the juxtaposition was extraordinary and jarring. Beaux-Arts gardens designed in the 1910s now populated with avant-garde sculptures from the 1950s and 60s. Classical order disrupted by modernist provocation, and this was Nelson's vision, the fusion of old wealth and new culture, the demonstration that Rockefeller money could be as forward-looking as it was traditional, and he used Kykuit strategically, hosting presidents. Lyndon Johnson came and walked the gardens and discussed Vietnam policy, Richard Nixon came and planned political strategy, Gerald Ford came as both vice president and president, Ronald Reagan came and saw a model of the kind of power he aspired to, and Nelson hosted foreign leaders, dictators and Democrats alike, the Shah of Iran Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who shared Nelson's taste for grandiose construction projects and authoritarian modernization, King Hussein of Jordan, who needed American support to maintain his throne, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who was negotiating the Camp David Accords, and Nelson hosted United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan, continuing the family's close relationship with the UN that had begun when Junior donated the land for its headquarters, and these weren't merely social occasions, these were real venues of power, places where policy was discussed and deals were made and alliances were forged, where the boundary between private wealth and public authority dissolved entirely, where being invited to Kykuit meant being ushered into the inner circle of American and international power, and Nelson's political career seemed destined for the presidency. He had the money and the name and the connections. He had executive experience as governor of America's second-largest state. He had foreign policy credentials from his service as coordinator of inter-American affairs during World War II and as Assistant Secretary of State for American Republic Affairs, and he sought the Republican presidential nomination in 1960 and 1964 and 1968, spending millions from his personal fortune on campaigns, but he never secured it, and the failure of 1964 was particularly bitter because it stemmed directly from scandal, from his personal life disrupting his political ambitions, because in 1963 Nelson divorced his wife of 31 years, Mary Todhunter Clark, mother of his 5 children, to Mary Margaretta Happy Fitler Murphy, and Happy was 18 years younger than Nelson, and she had been married to Dr. James Murphy, a virologist and close friend of the Rockefeller family, and Happy left her husband and gave up custody of her 4 children to be with Nelson, and the scandal was enormous, dominating headlines, and conservative voters were repelled by what they saw as moral bankruptcy. A powerful man destroying 2 families to satisfy his personal desires, and Nelson's poll numbers collapsed, and Barry Goldwater won the 1964 Republican nomination, and though Nelson would remain influential in Republican politics, though he would continue to shape policy and deploy his wealth in service of his political goals, the presidency would forever elude him, and this failure haunted him. The knowledge that despite all the Rockefeller money and all the Rockefeller connections and all the monuments he'd built and all the art he'd collected, there was one thing he couldn't buy or build or will into existence, and so when Gerald Ford became president after Nixon's resignation and offered Nelson the vice presidency in 1974, Nelson accepted, even though the vice presidency was a lesser position than he'd sought, even though it came with diminished power and little real authority, because at least it put him in the constitutional line of succession. At least it gave him a title that carried historical weight, and he served as vice president from 1974 to 1977, and his tenure was marked by continued art collecting and continued political maneuvering and continued frustration at being constrained by a role that gave him visibility without substantial power, and then on January 26, 1979, at age 70, Nelson Rockefeller died, and the initial story, the story that was immediately released to the press, was that he had died at his desk at Rockefeller Center, working late on a book about his art collection, a dignified death for a man dedicated to culture and public service, but this story lasted less than 24 hours before journalists began asking questions and details began to emerge that contradicted the official narrative, and the truth came out slowly, reluctantly, through forced admissions. Nelson had not died at Rockefeller Center but in a townhouse at 13 West 54th Street, a property he owned, and he had not been alone but in the presence of Megan Mars Hack, his 25-year-old aide who had been working for him since 1975, supposedly helping with the art book, and the initial call for help had not come immediately after Nelson collapsed but nearly an hour later, and it was widely alleged that Mars Hack was Nelson's mistress, that he had died not at his desk but in circumstances that suggested he and Mars Hack were intimate, and there were whispers about what exactly had been happening when the heart attack struck, and the family moved swiftly to control the narrative, arranging a private funeral with no public viewing, releasing minimal information, refusing to answer questions about the timeline or the circumstances, and the scandal followed Mars Hack for the rest of her life. She left public life entirely, retreated into complete obscurity, refused all interview requests, lived quietly and privately, and when she died in October 2024 at age 70, her own obituary, which she had written herself, acknowledged her notoriety around his death, with what one journalist called a suggestive last line, and the truth of what happened in that townhouse died with her. The full story of Nelson Rockefeller's final moments remains unknown, but what's certain is that even in death, even after a lifetime of carefully managing his public image, Nelson Rockefeller was surrounded by questions about power and secrecy, about the gap between public persona and private reality, about what powerful men believe they're entitled to and what they're willing to risk to get it. And his death became one more scandal in a family history that had never quite escaped scandal despite all the philanthropic millions, all the university endowments, all the medical research facilities and urban parks and art museums, because beneath the generosity there was always the memory of how the fortune was built, the destroyed competitors and the crushed unions and the children dead at Ludlow, and no amount of giving could completely erase that original sin, that foundational violence, and after Nelson's death, with his brother David, the youngest of Junior's sons, the banker who had become chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and one of the architects of late 20th century globalization, helping to open China to Western investment and promoting the interests of American capital around the world, taking his place as the family's most influential member, Kykuit itself began to transition from private palace to public monument, because the era of vast estates maintained by armies of servants was ending, labor costs were rising, social attitudes toward inherited wealth were changing, and even the Rockefellers recognized that maintaining Kykuit as a private residence was becoming increasingly difficult to justify, and in 1979, the same year Nelson died, he had bequeathed his one-third interest in the estate to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the bequest included the stipulation that Kykuit would eventually be open to public tours, that the house and gardens that had been private for more than 60 years would become accessible to ordinary Americans, and this was framed as an act of generosity, a gift to the nation, but it was also pragmatic, a recognition that the age of private kingdoms was over, that the future would require a different relationship between extreme wealth and the public, and in 1991 the Rockefeller Brothers Fund leased the historic area from the National Trust and began the process of preparing Kykuit for visitors, and in 1994, after renovations by New Haven architect Herbert S. Newman and Partners that included major infrastructure changes and a reconfiguration of third and fourth floor staff quarters into guest suites, note that language, reconfiguration, a euphemism for erasing the evidence of service, for converting the spaces where workers had lived into comfortable accommodations for wealthy visitors. Historic Hudson Valley began offering public tours, and for the first time regular Americans could take a shuttle van from the visitor center at Phillipsburg Manor in Sleepy Hollow, could ride up the winding private roads that Rockefeller Sr. had designed, could walk through the 40 rooms where 4 generations of Rockefellers had lived, could see the Chinese ceramics collected across decades, the European furnishings imported at enormous expense, the Ogden Codman Jr. interiors, could walk down into Nelson's underground art gallery and see the Picassos and Chagalls and Warhols hanging in the converted service tunnels, could walk through the terraced gardens that Bosworth had designed, could see the Oceanus Fountain and the Temple of Aphrodite and the Japanese tea house, could stand among the sculptures, Calder and Moore and Noguchi, could look out from the highest point in Picantico Hills over the Hudson River to the Manhattan skyline 25 miles south, and they could experience, for the price of admission, a carefully curated version of how the Rockefellers had lived, and yet even these tours were and remain carefully controlled. The narrative shaped to emphasize philanthropy and cultural stewardship, to present the Rockefellers as benevolent stewards of American progress rather than as beneficiaries of monopolistic practices and brutal labor suppression, and certain areas remain off-limits. The underground tunnels where servants moved are not fully open, the staff quarters have been reconfigured so visitors can't see how the workers actually lived, the archives contain expurgated records that emphasize positive contributions, and tour guides have scripts that mention the Rockefeller philanthropy, the donations to charity, the founding of universities, but that say little about Standard Oil's monopoly or the Supreme Court decision that broke it up, little about Ludlow and the dead children, little about the secret railroad rebates and the predatory pricing and the spies sent into competitors' companies, little about the servants who made this beauty possible and whose names we'll never know, and this selective memory, this careful curation, is itself a form of power, the power to control the story, to shape how history remembers you, to ensure that your crimes are footnoted while your virtues are headline. And as you stand in those gardens today, as you look at the Picasso, bathers, beside the Japanese garden or the Isamu Noguchi, Black Sun, or the Calder Staybill, as you walk through the 40 rooms with their period furnishings and their museum-quality collections, you have to ask yourself, what are you actually seeing? Are you witnessing the heights to which human ambition and aesthetic vision can aspire, proof that wealth can create transcendent beauty, or are you touring a crime scene, a place where the spoils of monopoly and labor suppression were converted into objects of beauty, where blood money was laundered into high culture? Can it be both? Must it be both? And what does it mean that the Rockefeller family chose to open Kykuit to the public, that they allowed us to see the mansion and gardens but not the full archives, not the complete financial records, not the unvarnished truth about how this fortune was built and maintained across 4 generations? Is the transition from private estate to public monument an act of generosity or a final act of control, a way to shape the narrative one last time, to ensure that the Rockefeller legacy is remembered the way the family wants it remembered rather than the way the full historical record might suggest it should be remembered? And consider the extraordinary persistence of this wealth, the fact that the Rockefeller fortune has now lasted across 7 generations, still valued at over $8 billion spread across 170 heirs, and this longevity, this ability to maintain wealth across more than a century despite estate taxes and market crashes and economic upheaval and social revolution, was achieved through trusts and strategic planning and the same meticulous attention to preservation that John D. Rockefeller Sr. brought to building his oil monopoly, and the trusts that protect this wealth were established by Jr., who learned from watching his father's public vilification that power must be disguised, that control must appear benevolent, that the key to maintaining a dynasty is to make it seem as though you're giving away the fortune while actually ensuring it remains within family control, structured in ways that minimize taxes and maximize preservation, and the Rockefeller philanthropies, the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University and the Rockefeller Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and all the other institutions bearing the family name, are real and have done genuine good, have funded medical research that led to vaccines and treatments that saved millions of lives, have supported universities that educated generations of students, have promoted conservation and environmental protection, but they also function as legacy laundering operations, converting the moral taint of monopolistic origins into the shine of public benefit, allowing each generation to point to the good their family has done rather than the harm their family committed to acquire the wealth that made that good possible, and this is perhaps the deepest lesson of Kykuit, the one that makes people most uncomfortable, that in America, if you have enough money and enough time and enough strategic thinking, you can rewrite your story, you can transform from robber baron to philanthropist, from labor crusher to cultural steward, from the man responsible for Ludlow to the family that saved the United Nations, from monopolist condemned by the Supreme Court to generous donor celebrated by universities, and the estate itself stands as physical proof that this transformation is possible, that stone and gardens and art can tell a new story, can make people forget, or at least not ask too insistently about, where the money came from in the first place, can create a beauty so powerful that it overwrites the memory of the ugliness that purchased it, and yet despite all the control, despite all the careful curation, despite all the millions spent on shaping the narrative, the truth keeps leaking out. The archives keep revealing uncomfortable facts, historians keep asking difficult questions, journalists keep investigating, and we're left with Kykuit as it actually is, not simply beautiful and not simply terrible, but both, always both, irreducibly both, a place where you can stand in a Beaux-Arts garden beside a Picasso sculpture looking out over the Hudson River and feel genuine wonder at the aesthetic achievement while also being unable to forget if you're honest with yourself, that every stone in every terrace was placed by someone whose name isn't in the official history, that every room in that 40-room mansion was cleaned by someone who could never afford to live in even one such room, that every sculpture in those gardens was purchased with money extracted from an economy that one man had monopolized so completely that the Supreme Court had to intervene, that the fortune that built this paradise came from crushing competitors and exploiting workers and creating a system of economic control so absolute that it threatened the very possibility of free enterprise, and the underground tunnels are always there beneath the gardens no matter how carefully they're hidden from the tours, the servants are always moving invisibly through the machinery of luxury no matter how completely the powerful pretend they don't exist, the children are always suffocating in that pit at Ludlow no matter how many universities bear the Rockefeller name. And this is the true story of Kykuit, the story America keeps trying to forget and keeps being forced to remember, the story that makes us deeply uncomfortable because it reveals that the things we most admire and the things we most condemn are often inseparable, that great wealth is never clean, that beauty built on exploitation carries a moral stain that philanthropy can never fully wash away, that the view from the highest point in Picantico Hills, magnificent as it is, was purchased at a price that we're still calculating, still discovering, still struggling to fully comprehend, and until we can look at Kykuit and see both the beauty and the cost, both the gardens and the tunnels, both the Picassos and the massacres, both the philanthropy and the monopoly, both the culture and the cruelty, we will never understand the true nature of American power, will never grasp the full complexity of what it means to build an empire, will never reckon honestly with the question of whether ends can justify means, whether beautiful results can redeem ugly methods, whether giving away half your fortune absolves you of how you acquired the whole, and Kykuit stands today, silent on its hilltop, its stone walls still warm in the afternoon sun, its fountains still flowing, its sculptures still gleaming among the roses, its 40 rooms still preserved in perfect period detail, its underground tunnels still there beneath everything though you can't see them on the tour, asking us the same question it has asked for more than a century, the question that echoes through every garden and every room and every archival document: what price paradise, and who decides who pays?